Uh, Good afternoon. Good morning. Sorry, make sure I start my timer, just to make sure I'm not running over time. Good morning, everybody. My name is Tom Scase. I'm a senior technology consultant at Avecto, and Avecto is now a Bomgar company. So what we're going to be talking about today is the challenges associated with privileged accounts and privileged access. So why is it so important for organizations to try and manage privileged accounts? Well, these privileged accounts are required to configure and run the systems. Your IT teams need them to do their job, but also attackers are looking for these credentials. Because if they get access to these credentials, they can disrupt your business, they can steal your data, they can steal the customer's data. And this can obviously lead to financial losses, it can lead to penalties, reputational damage, and also reductions in shareholders' value. A few examples of some recent stories. In 2017, HBO were compromised due to the lack of governance over credentials, and that led to Game of Thrones scripts being published online, so a few spoilers there. We also got Target, so a well-known breach in 2013 where there was actually a member of a third party that their credentials were compromised, and they were just a refrigeration team. So credentials, valid credentials, were compromised from a third party. And then one that's closer to home in the UK, in 2016, there was a breach in there just from a junior employee actually just misusing their privileges to gain access to customers or patient credentials, patient data. And a breach could be one of the reasons why an organization may be looking into a privileged access management solution, and that may or may not be down to the misuse of privileged credentials. There may be other factors that are a reason. Maybe the organization is tired of providing a vendor with local admin rights just so that they have no restriction on being able to do what they need to do when logging in externally, for instance. Maybe that they've already identified that privileged accounts or the use of them is a risk. A lot of people are now under the impression or assuming that, let's not pretend that attackers are going to be coming in. Let's just assume that the malicious insiders are already in the business. So what do we do to reduce their access and how much damage they can actually do? We may also just be trying to enforce the new corporate policy for passwords to maybe reduce weak, reused, or old passwords in the organization. And it might be simply just so that we can start meeting compliance mandates such as GDPR. So as I said there, I think most people agree it's more of a matter of time before there is a breach, rather than will we get breached. It's more of when rather than if. And if we just take a look at those breaches that are caused by employees or third-party vendors, we can see that the percentages are huge. And if we compare the two, so we've got the employees at the top and third-party vendors at the bottom, we'll actually see that the results are quite similar. They've got the similar number of breaches per, whether they're third-party vendors or actually insiders, actual employees of an organization. But I think it's clear that those organizations that have no privileged credential control or no control over their privileged credentials, that's where we see the most breaches. And those that have a privileged identity management solution or a privileged access management solution, there are significantly less breaches that are occurring. And what we find is that, despite companies understanding that breaches are increasingly likely, we're putting a lot of trust into our employees, a lot of trust into our IT security. And that's because we're providing both the insiders, the employees, and the third-party vendors with these privileged accounts. So accounts with local admin privileges. And we actually find that the financial services sector are actually topping the charts there, giving the most trust in their employees or third-party vendors. And even so, there's actually a clear lack of privileged access management and monitoring. We'll see there that only a third of the companies that have complete visibility of their employees that have privileged access. Only a third of them have actual reporting of the privileged user activity. And the same numbers for identifying threats from those privileged insiders. And this is a real problem because unlike breaches that are involving malware, account misuse or account compromise is a lot harder to detect. Malware can be detected in hours, days, weeks, but if we're looking at credential misuse, that can actually take months or even years before you identify a breach. And I think we highlighted a moment ago that there's a lot of trust that are put in these individuals with these privileged credentials. And it's more and more of a concern because this misuse of privileged credentials, this misuse of credentials is actually happening more and more. From the Verizon report, we can see that 81% of breaches leveraged either stolen or weak passwords. And also, it's not just about the credentials, the stealing of the credentials or the misuse of credentials. These attackers are going to start with the easiest point of entry, and they're going to start leveraging outdated, unsecured access methods as well. So it's not just the privileged credentials, it's how we gain access to these resources and servers, etc. And once they've got access, that's when they're going to pursue the credentials once inside. So there's actually two big problems that we need to solve, and it's the dual threat of remote access and privileged credentials. Back from the Verizon data breach investigations report and TrustWave's global security report, if you look at those reports, you'll see that both of these will tell you that the remote access and privileged account use top the list for common attack vectors. And it's the legacy remote access tools that are no longer suitable to provide the protection that's needed. So we find that employees are using their own tools to gain access to network systems. And it's poor identity management which continues to contribute to these breaches. So what we need to do is to develop this comprehensive privileged access management strategy. So if we look at remote access, unsecured remote access is the #1 method of compromise. And that tops the list by contributing to approximately 30% of the time of a breach. It's down to unsecured remote access tools. And this can be down to a number of reasons. It could be that there's lots of listening ports out there, so it's quite easy to find these unsecured remote access. Companies have no real control over the remote access that individuals are using, so they could be using things like TeamViewer, like LogMeIn, GoToMyPC. And because of this, teams end up operating in silos. So it leaves out central monitoring and auditing. And plus, there's a strong lack of privileged credential management. So if we have the access methods, or if we're using different types of access methods which gains us access to the logon screen, then it's just a matter of phishing for an account to actually access that system. If they do gain access to a privileged account, then we say that they've got the keys to the kingdom. You know, if I've got local admin rights on a desktop, on a server, then I've pretty much got full control over that server. And there may be projects to secure privileged access, but a lot of the times we leave out groups that have admin credentials, and things like the IT support teams, maybe teams that are in development, etc., we forget about trying to manage those teams of users. Or they may actually fail to consider the non-traditional accounts, such as logins to social media. It might not be a local admin account that the users gained access to, but think of the damage that could be caused if someone gained access to the corporate Twitter account. And a good example of that, if anyone's looking, do a bit of research for the British Milk Council. It's quite interesting. someone actually left the business, wasn't too happy, and yeah, they started to abuse the Twitter account, which is good for a laugh. So it's easy to forget that these privileged accounts are not just user accounts. So it's not just an account that someone may log into a system with. So what else is there that's actually considered privileged? Well, this is the footprint that I'm actually talking about. We've got a lot of privileged sprawl out there. We have service accounts, and they're given privileges to the services so that they can access local and network resources. We've got cloud services, and they may be belonging to applications or virtual machines. We've got app-to-app privileges, so maybe they could include hard-coded credentials in scripts or applications. And then we've got the kind of the system administrators, the insiders that need to perform administrative tasks on desktops and servers. And then we also have the third-party vendors, and we've got their third and fourth parties. Because what we find is that we might be outsourcing some of the administrative control to a third party, but then they outsource it again to somebody else. So is the solution to all this actually locking the environment down? Well, not necessarily. Because we know that if we grant permissions in an uncontrolled, untraceable way, that's going to leave the organization very vulnerable. But if we enforce security measures and put them in place that slows down an employee, prevents them from being able to do their job as efficiently, then they're going to find their own dangerous workarounds. And that could include maybe never logging out of their desktop, never logging out of the server. Maybe they now write down that 30-character complex password which IT are enforcing them to use. Maybe they now download data to portable drives or transfer them via personal email or even cloud services. So I think what's important is trying to make sure that we're finding the right balance between end-user productivity and security. And in order to do this, we need to collect data, analyze it so that we can make informed policy changes. And the focus is more than just the account and its privileges. I touched on this earlier. We need to focus on remote access and the privileged credentials of our employees and those third-party vendors. So for a successful privileged access management implementation, we recommend you follow these following steps to address the remote access and privileged credential challenge. They don't necessarily need to be in this order, and you can kind of pick and choose which ones you prioritize based on your organization. So number one, we've got the securing the vendor access, securing the insider access, remove the risk of shared passwords, rotate and randomize those privileged credentials, secure the service accounts, and finally, remove the threat target with app-to-app security. And I'm going to look at each of those individually now. So I think this one is massively important, is how we actually secure the third parties that are connecting, because we're finding more and more third parties are connecting every single year. But this is probably the easiest one to actually enforce, because if we've got external third parties connecting in, we can dictate how they're going to connect. And we can actually improve their experience as well. It's not about slowing them down. No longer do they necessarily need to use a VPN to connect in. We can provide easy access portals that makes their experience even better. We then want to do the same with the insiders. So it's not just the third-party vendors that are coming in and connecting in and using privileged credentials. We want to do the same for the actual employees. So from an access point of view, from a kind of a summary, what we want to do is make sure that we've got the best of both worlds, making it secure enough, but also user-friendly enough that they can remain productive without having to try and find these unsecure or unsafe workarounds. And that can include having this single interface, being able to access it anywhere on any network, firewall friendly, so we don't have to punch through firewalls, etc. And then we're also getting rid of the need for shadow IT, network segregation, and we can do all this whilst auditing and monitoring exactly what is going on. And what do we want to do around the privileged credentials? Well, we can protect these credentials now. Instead of an end user knowing what the password is for the third party and sharing it with the rest of the team, we can now actually put all of these privileged credentials into a safe. And we're not just talking about random generated passwords that someone has to go to a web page, check out a password and copy and paste it, or use that to actually log into a system. We're now talking about auto-injecting those credentials into the session. So there's no visibility, no requirement to actually share those passwords. And if we do presume that the attackers are already in, the actual life cycle of an account is as long as that account's password is valid. So even if someone is in and they're actually using some privileged credentials, their damage that they can do is only lasts as long as that password is valid. So what we can do there is we can now limit the damages by changing the password each and every time that password is used. We can also secure the service accounts, and these service accounts are easily forgotten about. We install something, we actually set a service account, and therefore they rarely change those passwords, and they just get left in there so that they're oldest passwords, but they're privileged credentials. So what we can do here is we can also rotate these. We can rotate the service credentials, but we need to make sure that the system remains available whilst we're doing this. So we need to make sure that we're managing these privileged accounts correctly. And then finally, we've got the threat that's app to app. A lot of time that we say we get these hard-coded credentials that are that are part of scripts or part of the applications. Now what we can do is we can take those username and passwords out of the scripts, and we can use APIs instead to inject those credentials, those privileged credentials, into those applications. So just a summary on what we can do from from a credentials point of view. So we looked at access, this is credentials, and it's very similar. So we've got the single interface, we can do the automation of injecting the privileges, no need for users to copy, paste, we're vaulting the privileged credentials, and we can do things on demand. So just a summary before I actually go into a bit of a demonstration. The 6 steps: secure vendor access, secure the insiders, remove the risk of shared passwords, rotate those passwords, secure service accounts, and also secure it from an app-to-app basis also. So let me show you some examples of this in action. Let's just check how I'm doing for time. So very good for time at the moment. Are there any questions so far? Just while I'm jumping between the...
I wondered, the company that's ISO 27001 certified, does
Yep.
it comply with all that?
I'm not sure from the compliance side of things. We work with a lot of customers to try and meet compliance mandates. So reduction, number one on the list is usually minimize the number of local administrators, but also the access to privileged credentials is obviously very important as well. I've got, as I said, you'll see from my my background here, I actually work for a company called Avecto, who was bought by Bomgar recently. So our solutions are very much complementary. So the remote access, securing the remote access, securing the credentials that are used. But later on in the session I'm doing this afternoon, I'm going to talk about how the actual user that logs onto the endpoint, whether it's a server or desktop, do they need the admin credentials themselves, or is it the individual applications, the tasks, the scripts that require those privileges? So in the afternoon, I'm going to show you how we can actually remove the admin rights from all of the users, and that's typically something that the compliance mandates are looking for you to meet, whitelisting capabilities, etc. So it's, absolutely securing the connection, securing the actual credentials that are used, but then also from an endpoint management perspective, let's be much more granular and control the apps, the tasks, the scripts that need those privileges also. So just to give you an idea of this environment. What I'm actually going to do now is I'm going to run through a couple of scenarios. I mentioned about the third-party vendor access and also the insiders. When there are, if you think of someone in the help desk that needs to access a server, someone as a third-party vendor that needs to remotely connect into an environment and manage their server with their technologies that are installed. I'm going to run through a couple of those during this session. So on here I've got a Bomgar console. So this can be something that's installed locally, but we can also have a web console. So minimum amount of installation needed on a device. I'm going to first of all log in as a test user. And I think I've got let's delete that. That is a very complex password there. It's not that complex. I don't know where that came from. Right, so let me do test user 1. Okay. Great, I'm in. So what you'll see now is I've logged into the console. So if you imagine normally an end user may have, or let's say someone from the help desk has access to a number of servers. They've got admin credentials, maybe on a number of these servers. What we're doing now with the privileged identity management and privileged access management, the user logs into the console and they're only given visibility of the servers that they have access to, that they should have access to. So my user that I'm logged into here, I've got a number of endpoints that I can connect to. I've got a Linux box, and I've got a number of options to jump to one of my Windows machines. Now I'm actually going to jump onto this Windows server, and I can just double click on there, and you can do the remote desktop access, or you can use this client to actually connect in. And if you think of what would normally happen at this point when I'm connecting in, I would then have to go through the logon sequence, and I need to know what a password would be. But what we can do with the Bomgar console here is I can actually just inject the credentials. So here I've part of my identity management. We know that this user has access to particular accounts. So maybe I'm logged onto my desktop as a standard user, but when I log onto this server, I've got access to this more privileged account. But I don't need to know what those credentials are. I don't need to go to a save checkout, complex credentials, and then paste them into this environment. I can just do injection onto that machine and allowing me to gain access to it without at all knowing what any of those privileged credentials may be. And as I said, what we can also do there is that checkout and injection of those credentials. When I log out of that box, there'll be a checkbox that says the user has logged out, so we can actually rotate that password, change that password so it's no longer being used again on that machine or by that user. But what we can also do is, it's not just about remote access, the privileged credentials, but you can also, the additional benefits there that we can do to actually, for collaborating in these types of scenarios. I said there that we've got this Bomgar console which is installed on my user's endpoint, maybe because I use the remote access solution to access multiple machines and part of the business. But maybe I want to go and actually get in touch with a third-party vendor and ask them for some assistance. So maybe I'm a little bit stuck, don't know how to do what I need to do on that server. Well, what I can actually do is request assistance. So I can go up here and I can invite an external user. So I can choose which type of policy. So I'm going to request that they see my screen, but also I'm going to give them the ability to control the screen as well. So I've just put what option in there. So I'm just going to say vendor. Nope, click that wrong. So vendor, vendor expert. I need your help. Okay, so we're going to create an invitation. And you can see here, this invitation is just a hyperlink. So I'm going to copy this URL. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pretend that I've emailed that to somebody. But on this same machine, I'm just going to open up the web browser. So imagine that this is an email that I've sent to the third-party vendor. I've asked them, can you come and help me? All they need to do is drop that address into the web browser. And what I'm going to do now is I could download the Bomgar Access Console like I've got on my machine and install this, but I don't actually need to install anything. I can actually just join through the web browser. And then you can see now, without installing anything on that endpoint, what we should see in a moment. We should see. Let me try that again. Yeah, the key ran out, so I have to do that again. Apologies. So I'll do that. Try to do that quicker. So sending it to myself.
The lifetime of this URL.
Yeah, so that it was the one time only, that URL. So copy the URL. It's all the benefits of doing live demonstrations. There we go. So you can see now that whether it's the control that's been taken over by the third party, that you can see the mouse moving around on the other screen, or if it's just shadowing what the user is doing on this side, there was no requirement for the third-party vendor to install anything. They simply just clicked on the link, we invited them in, and they're able to shadow, take control, and assist in this remote access situation. So there we've seen some privileged credentials being injected. I don't know what those credentials are. I've also requested some support from a third-party vendor. But we can also show you what else we can do around the access controls. So if I just log out of this as my test user 1, I'm going to log back into the Bomgar console as a vendor now. So I'm going to log in as test vendor 1. And it's my complex password here. There we go. So now, being another person, I've got different access. I can only see all the servers that I'm allowed to administer. And what you'll see here is we've got different policies which are applied to this access. So you may see just down here, it actually says the jump policy. There's an approval that's actually required for this user to be able to gain access to this server. So again, just check on time. Yeah, I'm still good for time. What we'll do is this third-party vendor is going to request to gain access to the server. It's saying that they're going to, actually, it's because I already did a request before in my test. Right, let me just go backwards. Create a request. Right, so what I'm going to do now is do a request. Apologies, I was testing my session before, and what you'll see is that I did a request for 2 hours, so I had access for 2 hours. Yeah, and that's it. Yeah, part of the actual the demonstration is to show the email request come in. So imagine this user wants to be able to gain access to the server. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make the request to the authorizer. So I need to patch the Win server. Okay, so I'm going to say request how long I need to be able to do this for. I can click OK. Time range overlaps. There we go. So what? I shouldn't have tested this before I started. So what happens, as you saw a moment ago, there was a request that comes in saying that the user had made a request. So actually, if I go into my deleted items, I'll show you what actually came in. Here we go. So the actual user request comes in, and what actually happens is the authorizer can click on the response, so they can respond to the request. They can authorize the request, which is already authorized. You can leave a message for the user, so when they do actually go to connect to jump, They get the notification from the authorizer so they can actually put in some information. So I said there, please don't break anything. And then in a similar way, I don't need to know what these credentials are, being the third party that is connecting in. I can do the Control-Alt-Delete. Control-Alt-Delete, I can inject the credentials which I have access to. So different to the credentials that maybe somebody else has access to. But again, it's just a matter of injecting those credentials in. And what happens there is there's a notification that now goes to the authorizer to say that this person has connected, they've started their session, and when they're finished, they can actually go back, close the session, and then they also get notification to say that the user has logged off and their session has ended. So detailed information going to and from the authorizer, etc. There we go, we can see that a session has started, a session has ended, and everything that I'm doing as that third-party vendor, we can actually record those sessions. So we've got session recording in there to make sure that when somebody's logging on with these injected credentials, so even though I don't know what they are, we can actually put session recording in place so we can actually see what was actually done at that time. There's other features in the product which I won't go into now just for the interest of time, but we can also start to look for and search for specific applications that may have been run. So if you want to make sure, check that if somebody ran PowerShell elevated, if they ran the command prompt elevated, are they doing things that they shouldn't? You can actually search for those and it'll take you to that point in time in a video where those applications may have been executed. So I appreciate there's, I think I've kind of gone to, I think actually a little bit shorter of the time that was needed, but if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to take those. As I said, the session that I've done this morning is all about the privileged access management, privileged identity management, but also I'm doing a session in the afternoon all around the removal of admin privileges, both on the desktops and in the servers. So once a user has been vaulted to a desktop or gained access to a desktop or a server, do they need the admin rights that they're logging on with? And I'll show you this afternoon that that's not the case. So any questions there?
Yeah, so the product also has a vault with all the passwords, etc.
That's correct, yes. So there's a password vaulting part of the product that you can do. You can do it's even the scanning of the privileged credentials out there. You can change them. You can manage those privileged credentials. So it's not just about the vault that kind of injects them during the access time. It's also you can manage all of the privileged accounts out there. And it's not just on Windows devices. It's talking Linux, network switches, etc. Anywhere that you've actually got privileged accounts in the environment.
Is there a gateway I need on the edge of my network in order to allow vendors to connect in?
Yeah, so it's done by an appliance. So we have a virtual appliance or a physical appliance, and that manages the connection inbound and to and from the actual resources. I think that may have been me hitting the back of my microphone there, sorry. At the back?
Yeah, how do you mitigate man-in-the-middle attack if there is a sniffer at your customer and you don't know about it?
If there is a what, sorry?
A sniffer, a network sniffer at the customer, how do you mitigate a man-in-the-middle attack?
I'd probably need to understand a little bit more of the kind of the attack that we're looking at there. Yeah, so, well, as I said, I'm part of the Avecto team, so it might be more of a question maybe one of my colleagues in Bomgar will be able to answer. But probably... Yeah, go ahead, please.
So obviously the connections are encrypted between the gateway, the appliance, and target systems and users. And if you decrypt or you inspect the SSL traffic or you want to be man in the middle, then the appliance automatically drops the connection because we can't be certain that this connection is actually coming from the target system.
Okay.
Okay?
So it's automatically detected, let's say.
It is, yeah. So we do not accept anything in between. That's the basic point. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for your time this morning. Please feel free to come over and speak to us. We're just out there on the left-hand side, and we can give you, go into more demonstrations and give you some more details. But thanks for your time this morning. Thank you.